Namaskar, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I am Namrata Singh and you're watching Perspective. On October 24th, the world celebrated United Nations Day, commemorating the organization's founding in 1945. And in 1947, the United Nations General Assembly designated this day to inform the global community about the UN's goals, solidifying its commitment to global cooperation, peace and international relations. The UN's influential role in uniting nations for a better world is paramount, especially in the face of rising global challenges. Therefore, reforms in the UN are necessary in order to strengthen its effectiveness as a multilateral organization, bring more transparency to the institution, and enhance its credibility. Most nations concur that the Security Council should include more voices in its decision-making. India's relationship with the UN since its inception has been dynamic and multifaceted. As a founding member, India has been a staunch advocate for global peace, security and development. India has been at the forefront for advocating for UN reforms, particularly in the UNSC. This push for reform was also a central theme in the discussions at the G20. In our conversation today, we will explore how the UN can continue to foster a world of unity and progress, why UN reforms are necessary, and India's role in an inclusive world order. To discuss this and much more, I'm joined by a very eminent panel of guests. Joining me in the studio is Ms. Neha Bansal. She's Senior Policy Specialist at G20 United Nations Development Programme. We also have in the studio Mr. Prabhu Dayal, former ambassador. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Sansad TV. Ambassador Dayal, let me commence the discussion with you. The United Nations was set up 78 years ago. There have been certain achievements since these many years. But in the light of global events, the United Nations has been under scrutiny for its structure and decision-making process. Why the talks of reforms?
Well, Namrata, first of all, thanks for having me on your show.
Thank you, sir.
You know, reforms are necessary in the United Nations because this world body is not able to carry out the tasks which are expected from it. Let me mention first of all that India has a belief in the unity of the global system. The world is increasingly getting globalized. Whatever happens in one place impacts developments in other parts of the world. And our Prime Minister has repeatedly emphasized his belief in Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. And he has tried to send a message to the rest of the world that this is the time for everybody to realize that it's one world, one family, one future, which is why he chose this as the theme for India's presidency of the G20. Now, of course, it must also be emphasized that not only does he talk of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, he also implements this policy in whatever manner he can. For instance, during the COVID epidemic period, Prime Minister adopted the policy of vaccine Maitri and sent out vaccines and COVID-related medicines to about 150 countries. Unfortunately, the world is not being able to come together because of the fact that there is increasing global polarization. Of course, the Russia-Ukraine war had divided the world as never before since the Second World War ended. Of course, the recent war between Hamas and Israel has further polarized the world. And there is a need for the United Nations to step in and restore peace. Unfortunately, the United Nations is also highly polarized. On the one hand, there is the United States and its NATO allies. On the other hand, Russia and China, countries like Iran and some others. This division also runs through the Security Council, which is the body in the United Nations which is tasked with maintaining global peace. You would know that recently there were attempts to push through resolutions relating to the Israel-Hamas war, firstly by Russia, but that was vetoed by United States. Then there was an attempt by United States, but that was vetoed by the other side.
Yeah.
So this polarization within the UN Security Council is affecting its functioning. And the Prime Minister of India has pointed out when he addressed the United Nations General Assembly that there is a need for UN reform. The United Nations was set up in 1945, 78 years ago, and the world has changed so much since then. Unfortunately, the United Nations has not been able to keep pace with the changing realities of the world.
True.
Now, why is it so important from, for instance, India's point of view? When the United Nations was set up in 1945, India was not an independent country.
True.
But look at how the scenario has changed since then. Today, India is the leading global player. Unfortunately, in the UN Security Council, India does not enjoy a permanent membership. So there is a need to give, for instance, India and other countries like Brazil, like South Africa, like Germany, Japan, their due place in the United Nations system as it has emerged today, as it exists today, so that these countries can play more meaningful roles. So in a nutshell, the reform of the UN Security Council in particular and of the UN system as such is necessary if this international body is to be able to perform its tasks more effectively and in particular maintain international peace.
Ms. Bansal, you are associated with the United Nations, and recently at the 78th session of UNGA, UN Chief Antonio Guterres called for reforms in multilateral institutions. What are your views on the reforms?
Let me start by saying that it is absolutely immoral for the UN to continue in the manner that it is. We have crossed the time when it is really about relevance or representation. I don't think we can conceive of a world, that is sort of dictated by the P5, which are really 5 powers that were victorious during a war that took place 80 years ago and continue to sort of lay out the direction of development. So I would really argue and say that it is first of all absolutely immoral that we are under a development order that is run by 5 countries. Also, I want to say that, of course, India has been pushing for its due place at the UN Security Council, and there is enough reason why India, the largest democracy, one of the largest populations in the world, really the kind of success that India has shown even to get the declaration at the G20 and so much more should find its place at the UN Security Council. But let's also remember that there are many other countries also rooting for their own, name at the Security Council.
Yes.
So whether it is Brazil, Japan, Germany, and I think the first thing that we must remember is that while it is immoral, we are, as India, a voice among perhaps 4 more that are really rooting for their place.
Yeah.
Also, the fact is that the entire debate on the reform of the Security Council, whether we talk about permanent members or non-permanent members, is really guided by 3 forces, one of which is what I mentioned, the G4, which is the 4 countries that are trying to find their place at the UN Security Council. And then is the consensus of unity, the unity of consensus, which is really a grouping that is arguing for the expansion of non-permanent members. And to my mind, it is extremely important that we start to engage much more with this grouping, with what they are trying to say. And the reason for that is that we have to understand that it isn't just about one country or another country finding their place as a permanent member. It is really to ask what is it that we want to achieve, by this expansion of the UN Security Council. And in that respect, we must really engage with the consensus of unity of consensus. And the third grouping is the African Union. I think about 70% of the UN resolutions are made in favor or with respect to Africa. And so the African Union is also, seeking its place. Two seats is what they ask with veto powers at the UN Security Council. So it really is going to be, how do you get a common agenda among these three movements within this whole ask of the UN reform?
Ambassador Dayal, help us understand how important it is to have the permanent members.
Well, the permanent members were put in place in the UN Security Council in the aftermath of the creation of the United Nations, because these were the powers which were victorious in the Second World War, and they were in a position to carve out the manner in which they wanted to see the world evolve. So they were given this permanent membership of the UN Security Council. But what has happened is that with the passage of time, their differences have only widened, and they have used the veto power which was given to them to promote and serve their own narrow interests. Their veto powers were meant to prevent any sort of mischievous or negative development from taking place. But what has happened is they veto anything which does not serve their own narrow interests. So the permanent membership has actually become an impediment for the smooth and proper functioning of the United Nations. But what can we do about it now? That is the way in which the United Nations is structured. If you want to bring about a reform in the UN Security Council, then the 5 permanent members have all to vote in favor of that reform. Now, for instance, if there is a proposal to bring in a country like India as a permanent member, and even if 4 out of the 5 permanent members are in favor of it, and one country vetoes it, the proposal falls through. And for sure, countries like China will certainly veto against such a proposal, because China is increasingly using the United Nations to promote its own narrow interests, as indeed the other permanent members are doing. Now, China is following a policy of hegemony. It is increasing its global role, global dominance as it sees it, and it openly says that this century is going to be the century of China, and it will do everything within its means to ensure that this happens. Now, the problem there is, how do you stop the United Nations from being misused by China? For instance, when the UN tried to blacklist Pakistan-based terrorists and terrorist organizations, China vetoed that. And it came in the way of countering terrorism. So China does what suits its own narrow interests. Pakistan is its client state, and China did not want Pakistan-based terrorists to be singled out for action or to be, taken note of by the United Nations and made into the global terrorist sort of phenomena. So the point I am trying to make is that because of the fact that the UN has been structured in this manner, because the permanent members are using it to serve their interests, bringing about a change is very difficult at this stage.
So do you think it's a transparency, can be increased in the UN?
It should be increased. I'm reminded of one of the verses of Omar Khayyam, which says, "Could you and I with fate conspire to wreck the sorry scheme of things entire? Would we not shatter it to bits again and mold it nearer to the heart's desire?" There is a need to revamp the whole United Nations system and rebuild it on more realistic foundations. Unfortunately, it's not going to happen because those who are bestowed with veto power will not let any meaningful change take place.
True, true. Ms. Bansal, India has demonstrated itself as a responsible global power and has made a significant contribution to global peace efforts. In what ways do you see India's role evolving in the ongoing efforts to reform and strengthen the United Nations on the international stage?
Let me answer this question by actually going back to your topic for this afternoon, which is, the reform of the UN in the light of globalization. So let's first understand what's happening on globalization and then place India's efforts, and I'll come back to India's sort of effort with the G20 and reform of the multilateral institution.
Yes.
So when we talk about globalization, the first thing to remember is that we started from an era where it was beneficial for nations to be part of a globalizing world. So, when you open up, when you liberalize, when you're able to trade with other countries, when your border matters are not a depressant on trade, that adds to jobs, that adds to incomes, etc. So it's really about helping what's happening at the national level. So that's the first era of globalization. Then we came down to a hyper globalization era, which is that everything that you do at the national level is valuable to the extent that it allows you to participate in a globalized world. So industrial policy, intellectual rights, skilling, all is geared towards a globalized world. And now we are in an era where it is your national processes will allow you will be globalized to the extent that it is beneficial for you as a nation. So it's a little bit of a hybrid between the first two eras. Now, why is this really important? Because it is important to understand that here we are looking at UN conventions, say on trade security, on trade agreements, on justice, but also looking at a very strong voice from the UN to look at national space for policy making and national localization of development pathways. What that is going to result in is not a one fit for all, where we will have many different paths to development, and modernization, and that is going to be very, very crucial to how India positions this entire thing. Now, coming down to what India has really done with all of this, and I think very, very prudently under the leadership of our able Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, and also the Sherpa, Amitabh Khan for the G20. At the G20, we've devoted 7 paragraphs to the reform of multilateral institutions, and where we've said that they have to be fit for the 21st century and have very carefully, if you look at the language, really positioned things like the WTO, acknowledging agreements like the WTO, but national pathways to development. So the language that has been used has been exactly this middling path, and we all know that we've now got the other 20 countries, in fact 21 countries, to agree to that. So that is really the first step that India has made to bring that to a global table, which is extremely important. And maybe if you come back to me again, I want to touch on a very, very important point, when we're talking about reform of the UN, which is the cost factor. There is
I was about to talk about that the UN's financial instability, is it impacting its ability to carry out its mandated functions effectively?
The question really to ask all of us, that we all need to ask ourselves, is what is the cost of not reforming? And that is a huge cost. You see, going back to what I was just saying, which is that there will be different pathways to development, different pathways to modernity. Now, in order for that to really manifest and play out to its optimum level, you can't have 5 countries deciding which way development is going to go. If that is to continue, if these 5 countries are to continue to dictate or to sort of greatly influence the way development is going to go, we are going to be spending huge amounts of money to follow a path that is not the natural trajectory of the world. already at the G20, if you've seen, we have moved the conversation from millions to trillions, and it is going to cost about 4 trillion annually globally to meet our development demands. If we are to follow a system which is completely passé, which is completely irrelevant, that is going to increase multiple times. The 4 trillion is going to increase multiple times because we are putting a system that is already redundant, countries are moving away from it, and we are constantly trying to ensure that that is relevant and countries follow it. And I can give you a number of examples, but the cost factor of not implementing these reforms is something that none of us can afford now.
Considering that India is emerging as a leading voice of Global South, and inclusion of African Union as a full member of the G20 is one such example. How do you view India's role in championing the interests of these regions?
Well, India has been very, very emphatically pointing out that the countries termed as the Global South are most adversely affected by recent events. For instance, the Russia-Ukraine war. That brought about an energy crisis, that brought about a food crisis. And which countries were the worst affected? The poorer countries, the countries of the Global South. So India has been championing the need for addressing their requirements on a priority basis. Now, if they are not able to make two ends meet, how can they even afford to pay their annual subscription to the United Nations? So the United Nations is impacted because its budgetary requirements are not fully met. So there is a need to take a look at this entire spectacle in a holistic manner. Unfortunately, the developed countries have been looking at things from their narrow perspective. What our Prime Minister has been emphasizing is that priority should be given to addressing the needs of the Global South. Because if they are not attended to, then their condition will worsen, and I think we will all end up in a terrible situation, because whatever happens in one part of the world does affect other parts of the world. There is globalization, and this is what India has been pointing out.
Very quickly, closing comments from both of you.
As Ambassador Dayal very importantly touched on the Global South topic, let me say that in 2017, India co-developed the UN Development Fund, which is really looking at development models not just to the Global South, but from the Global South, and I think that's extremely important. There is a great amount of vulnerability in the Global South, but there's a lot of wisdom, and the Global North must learn from that. I think that's a very important initiative from India that must find its name on the table.
Ambassador Dayal, any closing comments?
Well, I think that it is really up to the P5 members to mend their ways. They should stop their policy of using the United Nations system to further their own interests, because their interests will also be adversely affected. If there is a lack of peace in the world, then no country will be able to prosper. And I think our Prime Minister has made this very clear, that unless you take a holistic view, unless you put in place a belief of sabka saath, sabka vishwas, sabka vikas, take everybody along, look after their interests also. The United Nations has to implement this belief and this policy if it has to make headway.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us on Perspective. Well, viewers, that's all I have for you in this edition of Perspective. Thanks for watching.